My name is Ellen Phillips, and I am the Extension Educator for Boone, DeKalb, and Ogle counties, and the instructor for today. Well, welcome, everybody. This is the last in a series of several webinars that we've been offering, and today's topic is rather timely because a lot of the pastures throughout the state are very green and much higher and fuller grown than they normally are for this time of year. And today's topic is on establishing pastures and as well as maintaining pastures. So if we go to the first slide, we're going to visit quite a bit today about pasture management. We're going to start off with that maintenance component and focus in on some of the important things of knowing what pasture plants you have in the pasture, doing soil testing and maintaining soil fertility levels, utilizing fertilizer or manure management, and then, of course, weed control, very important part of that. We will visit just a little bit about establishing pastures and renovating, and how do you know which way to go if you already have something out there. And then lastly, we'll just touch on grazing pastures and some things to think about because that topic alone is worthy of a couple of webinars in itself. But we'll just visit about it real quick. So today's topic then is pasture management, and when we look at pastures, it's really important to think about pastures from a long-term production standpoint and not just what it's producing today. And this is a good spring to think about that because many of these pastures are already up and growing and vibrant, and it's very tempting oftentimes to turn the animals out much sooner in the spring than we normally would. But if we are focused on the pasture forage plants and what they need in order to maintain a healthy root system, and because it's that root system that will allow those plants to very quickly regrow after they've been grazed down, or to come through a harsher winter than what we perhaps had this winter, but certainly it's an important thing to keep in mind. So our focus really has to be on the pasture plants, and particularly on the lower part of that plant that we don't see, the root system, and maintaining a healthy root system for quick reestablishment. The next question we need to ask when we look at our pastures is, what's the purpose of the pasture? What are we trying to get out of it? And a lot of it has to do with size. If we don't have a lot of pasture, or we have too many animals for the limited amount of pasture we do have, then it tends to get overgrazed, and we end up with a dry lot. And so the purpose of those areas primarily is just exercise. If we do focus on the pasture and have enough acreage to maintain quality pasture, then that can become part of our feeding regime for those animals. And on average, real general rule is that you want about 2 acres for every 1,000 pounds of animal. And of course, that's variable because it depends on the type of animal and so forth. It also depends on the quality of pasture you have and how well it's being maintained. So we have a very productive pasture. You're maintaining soil fertility levels, etc. You could potentially count on 5 to 6 tons of forage per year. If you are not as concerned about the quality of pasture, maybe not fertilizing on a regular basis, that can drop quite a bit lower to 1 to 3 tons per acre per year. I just mentioned that you want to have about 2 acres for every 1,000 pounds of animal. And that's a very general rule, and that would mean if you want to support that animal throughout the growing season on that acreage. And the chart here on animal units is just to give you a little bit of a comparison for determining how many animals you should have there. So in other words, if you have 1 animal unit, that's equivalent to 1 brood cow or feeder cow, but that's equivalent to a half a horse, because a horse is considered 2 animal units compared to that 1 cow. So you could go through, depending on which type of animal you're trying to have on the pasture, to determine how many animals per 2 acres approximately should my acreage be able to support. The next question you need to think about is, what is the purpose of that pasture? As we mentioned, if you don't have much acres, and generally 1 acre or less is maybe not enough acreage depending on how many animals you have, then for the most part that is really just an exercise lot. And so you're going to turn the animals out of their stalls or out of the barn for part of the day, get them some exercise, but most of the food consumption or feed will come from hay or grain that's being supplemented and not dependent on that those pasture forages. The other question becomes then, depending on the number of animals, is also the manure management within that, and that manure tends to accumulate in such a small area. So you might have to actually pick up that manure once in a while and remove it to prevent pollution from that. When we get much more than an acre, and again depending on the number of animals, then we have more potential to perhaps actually maintain pasture quality throughout the year and begin to use that as part of our feeding system for our animals. It helps if we can do what we call rotational grazing, where we would take, say, that 5 acres and divide it into minimally 4 paddocks and then move the animals from one paddock to the next, typically on a weekly basis, but there's many different grazing schemes that we can. And by moving them from paddock to paddock, we can give that forage in that paddock a rest period for about, hopefully, 30 days to allow it to recuperate and regrow so that when the animals are turned back into that paddock, there's enough forage for them to eat it down again. So rotationally grazing becomes possible when we have enough acreage to do that. The other benefit of having that much acreage allows the manure to be spread more uniformly throughout those paddocks, and as a result, we tend to leave that manure then and allow it to be recycled within that system and add nutrients back into the soil. Once we get much above 5 acres, again, depending on the number of animals, we have an additional option that sometimes can come into play, and that obviously we can support far more animals if we have more than 5 acres. But depending on the shape of the field and the type of fencing we have, if we have removable fencing in the interior of that pasture, then there's a potential for making hay, particularly in the spring, like now, where we sometimes, depending on the system, have an abundance of forage. Not all farms have access to haying equipment, so that decision will also be made on whether or not you have access to that equipment or can borrow it, or if you find a farmer who's willing to come in and hay that field for you at a custom harvest rate. Oftentimes farmers will tell you that they really prefer at least 20 acres in order to make it feasible for them to come in and make hay off of a field. So, but maybe you'll be lucky and find somebody who has smaller equipment to do a smaller acre. But that is a possibility once you get to a little bit larger acreages. In addition, then, for pastures that size, you would definitely be rotationally grazing, hopefully, and those manure would be spread again through the paddocks. But because unless you're very intensively grazing with a lot of animals, there may not be enough manure to necessarily recycle and provide enough nutrients for the forage that's being taken off. So we'd have to look again closer at soil test results in these kind of situations to see if we need to add more fertilizer. So that's just a real general picture of how the size of the acreage for your pastures can influence other decisions. So let's talk about pasture management, and particularly the type of forages that we would like to have in a pasture. For the forage species, we divide them up into some larger groups. What you're seeing here is a list of what we call cool season grasses. Those are smooth brown grass, orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, and perennial ryegrass. And there's some others out there that are possible forage plants. But the difference between our cool season grasses and in a moment you'll see warm season grasses is that our cool season grasses really do like to grow when it's cool. In other words, those are the ones that are growing really well right now, and when temperatures are in that 50s, 60s range. And so we have a lot of production in the spring, and we have a lot of production in the fall. But in that July, August time period, when it gets quite warm, these will slow down and not produce nearly as much. And as a result, that can affect our particularly rotational grazing in that we might not have enough forage in that time period if we have strictly grasses in that pasture. Now, as far as identifying what plants you do or don't have in your pasture, at the very end of the presentation, I have listed a few resources. We have an excellent little pocket guide on how to identify turf grass weeds in Illinois. And in that handbook are the not only weeds, but some of our pasture species here as well. And what's really nice is that it has excellent pictures of what we call the collar region of the grass plants in order to help you identify grasses. One of the key factors is to look at the collar region. And what I'm doing is here I'm circling two pictures of a couple of our grasses. On the right over here is orchard grass. And so if we were trying to identify orchard grass, you would take that leaf, pull it away from the stem, and you would look for auricles, which are like little arms sometimes that would come off of here that we don't see in orchard grass. And then it has a very large membrane ligule, as it's described. So by having that little book, you can begin to walk out into your pasture and identify what are the actual grasses that I have there. Are they good quality pasture grasses like the ones I've listed, or are they weedy species? And the difference between the two is that our forage grasses tend to have larger leaves and more abundant leaves, and so they're actually producing forage. Our weedy species may not do that. If you think of something like downy brome, it has very few leaves and a rather stemmy kind of a plant, and as a result, you would not get the tonnage from growing that grass over choosing a forage grass. So when we especially start to begin to look at, do we reestablish a pasture or do we renovate, knowing what pasture forages are actually out there is really important. So identifying these becomes a critical part of pasture management. The other potential forage that we'd like to see in pastures are legumes, and the predominant ones that are used throughout Illinois are alfalfa, red clover, ladino clover, and birchroot trefoil. And the important part of these plants is that they are legumes, which means they have a symbiotic relationship with some bacteria that grow in the roots and help these plants fix nitrogen that in turn can assist and be released in the soil so that the grass plants can benefit from having that nitrogen. In addition, these plants tend to be a little bit higher in protein content, and so can increase the forage quality within the pasture. And lastly, the benefit would be that they also tend to grow better in that July-August time frame, and so can maintain a little bit of forage out there when our cool season grasses are not growing as quickly. So there's some real benefits to having a mix of grasses and legumes within a pasture system, and which ones you choose and how you choose it depends on many, many factors we'll talk about in a little bit. The last possibility, or actually there's more than that, but another possibility would be warm season grasses, which are things like switchgrass, bluestem, and so forth. These are grasses that prefer to grow in that July-August time period. And so sometimes farmers will put in one paddock of a warm season grass so that they have paddocks ready for that July-August time period to turn animals into. We don't normally recommend mixing the cool season and warm season grasses together in paddocks because it makes management of those paddocks much more difficult. But you could potentially have one paddock or two of warm season grasses. There are also annuals that I haven't even mentioned in here that are potential, things like pearl millet and so forth, that for our more experienced grazers, they have found them quite useful in order to expand the options for rotational grazing in different paddocks. So we look at the next slide. This is just one of many tables that are available when you start looking into different types of forage pasture plants. And this is an indication of understanding the relationship between your pasture and the soil types there and where water sets or where water, the areas are dry, as well as high pH, low pH, all these soil factors that we need to take in consideration in deciding which forage grasses or plants would be best within that pasture. So in this case, if we look at alfalfa, alfalfa can tolerate drier conditions and soil types much better than it can tolerate a really wet soil type. If we look at our grasses, something like smooth brome grass can tolerate drier soil conditions than some of our other forage grasses. So knowing our soils also is an indication then of which plants you would want to have in the pasture. I often get the question of what's the minimum I can do if I don't want to manage my pastures as a daily, kind of intensive management grazing system. What options do I have? And Dr. Understander out of University of Wisconsin put together this list where he said that if you really don't want to manage grazing and you want to have just animals out on a pasture and continuously graze them, and those animals are going to tend to overgraze, the plants that you would probably want to put out there would be something like Kentucky bluegrass, and particularly here it would be a grazing Kentucky bluegrass, not a lawn Kentucky bluegrass. So do be careful when you're choosing species in that category, as well as your perennial ryegrass. And then there are some orchard grasses that have been bred to, adapted to more short grazing heights as well. And then the legume that you would choose would be a ladino clover. Otherwise, if you're going to actually manage your grazing and try and maintain a proper grass height and so forth, then you have a much wider selection of forages to choose from, particularly smooth brome grass, tall fescue, and then from legumes are a little bit more tolerant of grazing would be your alfalfa and red clover. Well, in order to maintain any forages, they do need the nutrients that they require from the soil. And so we're just going to touch on how to look at soil nutrients. The best way to know what nutrients are in the soil is to do a soil test. And the test that we recommend that you request would be a pH test, which is for the acidity or alkalinity. You would also request a phosphorus test and a potassium test. And the important thing here is that when you send it to the lab, make sure you ask for recommendations for pasture and not for a hay field. Obviously, a lot of nutrients get removed from a hay field, and so fertilizer recommendations tend to be a little bit higher for that. When to soil test, we recommend that you do a soil test every 4 years to maintain records on where those nutrient levels are changing. We prefer to see that done in the fall, but if you've never soil tested and you really want to do it, you could potentially take some samples now, and the recommendation then would be 4 years from now to take them at this time as well. As far as how to take a soil sample, it's if you go to that bottom tab there of how to mail it to the lab, I have indicated that on our University of Illinois Extension website, we do have a list of soil testing labs that are certified in Illinois, and you can send samples to. If you call them and say you're going to send samples, they will actually send you out instructions on how to take the samples and send you soil test bags and so forth. But as far as sampling goes in general, what you do want to do is identify your different pastures and paddock areas, and preferably you would take one sample from each paddock if at all possible. And within that paddock, you actually want to do some subsampling. You want to take several different samples, and the way to take a sample is up here on the upper right-hand side. I've got a couple of pictures. If you're lucky enough to have a soil probe or can borrow one from an extension office, that's one of the easiest ways to take samples. Otherwise, you can use a shovel and simply take a slice of soil off the depth of that hole that you're going to dig and put it into a bucket. And we do recommend that you take a sample down to about 7 inches deep. And so down here on the map, this is just an indication. If you have a large paddock, you would take several subsamples. So you would dig a hole here and here and here and put all those samples into one bucket and then mix it all together, and then that would be your sample that you send to the lab in order to have analyzed. You do want to also take in consideration where manure is being deposited, usually around a water source, underneath trees, those kinds of things, and avoid those areas where you might have an unsimilar area within that pasture. So you hopefully come away with a fairly uniform picture of what's in that paddock. When the soil tests come back, the range that we tend to like to hope or would like to see for pastures would be a pH range between 6 and 6.5 if the pasture forage is primarily grasses. If you have a lot of legumes in there, you'd like to see the pH to be a little bit higher, 6.5 to 7. For phosphate levels, we'd like to see it about 45 pounds per acre, and for potash levels at 260 to 300 pounds per acre. And the nitrogen recommendations are generally made from field research rather than from soil tests. The other considerations for other tests you might do would be if you're on a very sandy, low organic matter soil, or if you're growing alfalfa, you might want to also do a boron test, since that boron can be a problem sometimes for alfalfa. As to when to put the fertilizers down, you do want to always use soil test results to determine how much fertilizer should be put down. It can be put down potentially and broadcast in the spring or the fall after a grazing cycle. As for nitrogen, this depends on what kind of pasture mix you have. If you have 30% legumes in the pasture, then you don't need as much nitrogen, if any at all. If you have less than 30% legumes and primarily grass, then you can consider applying nitrogen. And that nitrogen amount then would depend on the level of grazing you're doing and just how much forage production you want. At an absolute minimum, you would probably want to put down 50 pounds of nitrogen in the spring. That's the most effective time. We'll get that grass up and growing. You could potentially come back after a grazing cycle in mid-June and put another 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. All these are per acre. And then the last time would be in early August. After a grazing cycle, you put down another 50 pounds, or a total of 150 pounds per acre for the entire year. And so all that really depends on how much you want to maximize the production of your field. Is it possible to put down too much fertilizer? And it always is, so we encourage you not to over-apply fertilizer, as there's potentially a source of contamination for our groundwater and surface water. I often find with smaller producers, our farms with not too many animals, that they tend to have more than adequate forage, and it's growing very well. And so if you have very abundant, lush growth, and your animals can't keep up with it, you may not need that nitrogen after that first grazing. But that's all where becoming more the art of the pasture management versus the science of pasture management comes into play. But with nitrogen prices as they are right now, that is something to think about. If your soil test results come back as for phosphate higher than 70 pounds per acre, then you will not need any more phosphate. And for potash, that would be 400 pounds per acre. The soil test results should interpret that and as well. Something else to think about is how that manure is being managed on the pastures. Manure is an excellent source of nutrients, and so if it is being dropped all over the pastures and spread fairly evenly, and it can be considered to be recycled within that pasture system. And so oftentimes we also do take a credit for the nutrients being applied in that manure, and that can also potentially lower the fertilizer needs within that pasture system. probably the most difficult thing to manage in pastures are weeds, so we're going to spend a few minutes talking about those. In order to control weeds, it really is important to know what weeds you are dealing with. We divide our weeds into two broad groups, those being grasses, things like your downy brome, barnyard grass, those kinds of grasses. And then we have broadleaf weeds, everything from pigweed to lamb's quarter to the more difficult ones like burdock or thistle. The reason that's important is because, particularly if we're going to choose a chemical control of herbicides, some of the herbicides can control grasses, some can control broadleaves, and some can control everything that's green out there and kill off anything. And so choosing the right herbicide for the right type of weed is very important. In addition, particularly with our broadleaves, not every herbicide works really efficiently for every single weed. We have some herbicides that are far better for controlling perennial thistles than others. And so knowing what weed we have becomes quite important. The next thing that's important to know about weeds is that they don't all germinate or grow in the same way. And we do need to understand their life cycle a little bit to know when to start scouting for them, in other words, looking for them in the pasture, because they are easiest to control when they are at what we call a cotyledon stage or a young stage, like here in this picture. Herbicides work much more effectively when they're this tiny than when they are really large, like these thistles in this picture over to the right. So understanding whether or not when the plant's going to germinate will make a difference. We divide our life cycles into four groups. We have winter annuals and summer annuals. Our annuals complete their life cycle in 1 year, but our winter annuals are a little unique in that they germinate in that August, September, October time period over winter and then flower sometime in the spring, early summer. And so that's their annual life cycle. The summer annuals are germinating now and for the next couple months and sometimes even longer depending on the season, and grow, produce a flower and seed head, and die all within the growing season. So knowing when to scout for these is important. So we're going to scout for our winter annuals in that early fall time period and the summer annuals in the spring to summer time period, and apply herbicide controls at those times. For our biennials, they complete their life cycle in 2 years, and that would be something like musk thistle, where they grow, start from seed, grow, produce a rosette, going into winter, over winter, and then produce that seed and head the next summer and die back. So the best time to control those, obviously, is the seedling, always, but also you could come back in the fall, use a systemic herbicide that's going to translocate through the root system, kill off the root system, and then that plant won't be back, hopefully. Our perennials are the most difficult to control. Something like Canada thistle has a very extensive root system, although it started as seed at some point. Perennials tend to have root systems that the plants can spread by and come back by, and as a result, once you have one Canada thistle, in a couple of years you might have 100 Canada thistle as it spreads. So these are a little bit more difficult to control. Again, as a seedling, they're the easiest to control. You can control them also between that seed, when they just begin to put up a seed head, to when they start to bloom, or as well as in the fall. So there's several options for controlling them. Another way to really control weeds well, for many of them, not all of them, is to mow. Because what we do want to do is prevent those weeds from going to seed. Because weed seeds, most of them will remain in the soil for 7 to 10 years and then can germinate. Some of them, more difficult ones like burdock or velvet leaf, can remain in the soil for 40 years and then germinate. So whatever we do, we want to keep them from putting out a seed head. So anytime we remove the animals from a paddock, we'd like to go in and mow. And you'll see that I put the mowing height at 4 inches. That seems a little high, and yet that height really does a lot of good as far as shading out any soil so that the weed seeds don't get light and therefore won't germinate as readily, or if they do, they'll be hopefully shaded out. So we do want to mow a little bit higher than we would, say, a typical lawn. So the benefits of mowing really can't be overstated if you have an opportunity to do that every time you move the animals. Just a real quick summary on how to minimize weeds in your pastures by this triangle put out by the NRCS. That bottom left corner basically says very dense vegetation. And that's true. Anytime you have bare soil, you will probably have weeds coming up. So the more we can do to encourage really good forage growth, the better off. We've already talked about choosing the right species of plants for our soils, as well as maintaining proper soil fertility over in the right corner there. And the upper middle part of that triangle, it says prevention. And so things like making sure that if we're mowing our lawns and then going into the pasture, that maybe when we want to clean out and clean that equipment before we take it from paddock to paddock, because it's going to carry weed seeds with it. In addition, if we are feeding our animals hay in our pastures, then perhaps you want to look at the quality of hay, make sure we're not bringing in weed seeds with that. The upper one, then, on managed grazing, it simply means that if we can possibly rotate those paddocks and give our grasses and forages a chance to recover, then we will maintain the proper density and really minimize weeds by following a good grazing system. And then lastly, if nothing else works, there are chemical options of herbicides, and there are many herbicides to choose from. Choose the correct one, follow the label to make sure that you're applying it the right size of plant, the right time of year, and have the right herbicide for the type of weed that you have. And then lastly, as far as pasture management goes, we have to speak about safety, because we want to make sure those animals are okay. So obviously before you put animals into a paddock, you are going to go out and just do a quick safety check, make sure there's no snails sticking out of fences, rocks and so forth that need to be removed. And then you also want to keep an eye on poisonous plants, not only in the pasture, but also in the perimeter of the pasture. The times I've been called out for animals down or sick, it's oftentimes the plants that are in the windrow around the pasture that are creating problems rather than the pasture themselves, or that there's so little forage that primarily the only thing in that pasture was weeds and some poisonous plants that the animals got into. So if we can maintain really good quality forage, poisonous plants hopefully will not invade into our pastures too readily. But do know what they are and look for them when you're out there. We're going to go on then and talk a little bit about establishing pastures versus renovating a pasture. When I talk about establishing, I mean completely tilling up what you have and reseeding it. For renovating, it's taking what you have and trying to build from there by properly grazing it. So here we have two pictures of two different pastures. One on the left, there's not much there, and it's also got some real hazards out there. So that would be an ideal situation to think about perhaps completely reestablishing that pasture. The picture on the right is a pasture that certainly looks pretty bare, but if you do some minimal renovation, as far as perhaps overseeding the few bare spots there, and or simply graze it well and not let the animals overgraze it, that area can come back within a year's time and become a very productive pasture. Well, how do you know if you need to establish a pasture versus renovate? One is do what we've already talked about. Go out and look at what the plants you have. Are most of the plants there weeds? If they are, then we probably do need to reestablish and get decent forage plants growing there. The other thing to do is to do the soil test. That will tell you a lot. So 3 hints on how or when you should replant or reestablish a pasture. One is if you do that soil test and the nutrient level, particularly for phosphorus, potassium, is very low, or if the pH is quite low and a lot of limestone is needed in order to adjust that pH, then perhaps that's the time to renovate, because by tilling those nutrients and amendments into the soil, they will go. You have a much better establishment of the pasture grasses. The second point there is, as I said, if you don't have any decent forage plants, you don't have smooth brome or orchard grass or any legumes out there, might be the time to reestablish. And then lastly, if you have plants out there, but they're primarily weedy grasses versus pasture grasses, because again, you want a forage grass that actually has fairly large leaves, high protein in that leaf to give good quality nutrition when the animals are eating. Well, how do we reestablish a pasture? Obviously, we've got to go in and kill off what's there. You can do it organically by tilling it under numerous times. Otherwise, there are some total kill herbicides that work very effectively at completely killing off anything that is green in that pasture. Then, if you have done the soil test and you need to apply fertilizers or lime, you want to do it at that time. Till that under to a depth of 6-7 inches at least, and then reseed. The times that we recommend reseeding are in August or in April. You've got a couple different ways to do that. The best way to put in seed is to drill that seed. You can potentially do it into an overgrazed paddock rather than all the tillage. It just depends on the situation. But drilling is certainly the best way. If you have no other option, you could also broadcast the seed and try to work it into the ground. You can harrow it lightly. You can drag it with a wire fence. I've seen some folks who don't have much acreage and just have the animals. They turn the animals out, let the animals work it in, and have a little bit of a success with that. So it just depends on what equipment you have available. But certainly if you can borrow the drill or have somebody come and do that for you, that is the best way to get the seed, a really good seed-soil contact to make sure the forages start growing. Well, after planting, it is important to leave the animals off of it until the forage plants are really well established, because otherwise the animals will just go in and pull them out. And normally we think about that from 6 to 8 weeks, but certainly that is highly dependent on weather, conditions, soil type, a lot of things. One thing that you can do to see if the plants are ready is if you can't pull them out of the ground, then an animal may not be able to graze it out of the ground either. So that's one indicator you might use to judge if you should put the animals back on. Well, what if we want to just renovate and bring back a pasture that just doesn't have quite as many forages as we'd like, but for the most part have fairly decent plants? Or if you want to simply increase the number of legumes in that pasture, what are your options? You can do this again in fall or early spring. What you would want to do is graze that pasture down or mow it to about 2 inches. There are some herbicides you can apply to sort of set back the growth of that pasture. Be really cautious in doing that, but that is one effective way to do it. Basically, you're trying to minimize the competition from what's there with what you're trying to plant. And then you would go in and drill the seed. And here it is very important to actually drill the seed. Broadcasting just won't work well. You have to have really good seed-soil contact so that those seedlings get up and growing very quickly and the other plants do not compete. And, of course, you would keep mowing until that new forage is up and growing and can compete with the established forage. How to get legumes in is another possibility, is what we call frost seeding, and this works primarily with red clover, because red clover is a rather large seed, and it's usually done in late February, early March up here in northern Illinois, and earlier if you're further south. And we normally would broadcast about 4 to 6 pounds of red clover over an acre, and then use that freezing thawing action that's occurring at that time where it's warm during the day and cold at night, and that frost action actually works that seed into the ground, and then once spring hits, the seed will take off and can start growing. And it works quite effectively to try and reestablish some red clover back into a pasture that has lost some of the forages from it. or for some of the legumes from it, I should say. Well, let's just go and touch really quickly on some grazing principles. We started off by saying how important it is, if you're going to get maximum production from your pastures, to try and divide those pastures into smaller paddocks and rotate the animals through it. And then we have to know, well, when do we put the animals on or take them off and so forth? And our guide is the pasture. And in this graph here is a graph of the difference between the quality of the grass, the forage, versus the yield of the forage. So you're seeing on the picture the plants growing bigger and bigger, and on the right side they've actually gone to seed. And oftentimes then when those plants are going to seed, they become more stemmy. There's not as much leaf material, and they're putting most of its energy into that seed. And as a result, the quality drops off. So that upper left line for quality you see is quite high when the plants are really small, and drops off once those plants start to put out seed. And that protein content is one of the best indicators of that once that plant starts going to seed, the protein content of the leaf significantly drops off. But if we wanted to maximize yield, maximize the volume that the animals could eat, then we wouldn't wait until those plants are mature and large. The problem, though, is also palatability, that the older the plant gets, it tends to get more stemmy and harder to eat, not as flavorful for the animals, and as a result, they don't consume as much, and they might trample more rather than eat more. So what we try to do in grazing is find a balance between the total volume of forage and the quality of forage. And so that depends on the types of plants we have in the pasture, but in general, what we look for is about 8 inches of height when we put those plants out, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, how do we graze? To me, the first step is to really understand your property and what the potential is for grazing and the potential for dividing up your pastures in different configurations. So the first thing is to draw a map. You put on your existing buildings, any permanent fence that's out there. Note any hazards. You want to keep them away from the wells, those kinds of things for environmental concerns. And, of course, hillsides can make a difference in how animals graze. And so all those things need to be noted on your map. The next thing you need to look at is in trying to decide the number of paddocks. There's a lot of science behind this, and it's another whole course in itself. But in general, what we do want is a very strong perimeter fence because we don't want the animals leaving our property. So when we look there, we need to decide what's the absolute limits of pasture that we can have and make sure that we have a good fence around that because there are potential, there are cheaper ways to fence on the inside that allows us a lot of flexibility in changing paddock sizes and designs. The other thing to think about is water. Our animals have to have water, whether it's winter or summer. And the amount of water depends on the type of animal, anywhere from 8 to 35 gallons of water per animal per day. That's a whole lot of water. And so the other thing to think about is, do we want stationary watering systems in each paddock? If we have that, you might end up with what we have down here in the right corner, which means nothing grows because the animals are always around the water. If at all possible, we recommend trying to move those watering locations around so that we don't end up with as many bare spots as what you see here. But all those are things that are options in our grazing design. For those internal fences, there's a lot of different electrical fences that are potentially usable, and it depends on the type of animal, obviously, as to how many, to what type of fence, and the number of strands of fencing, and so forth, as well as whether you have electric fence versus or electric power going out to the pastures, or a solar-powered option. So there's many different ways to divide those pastures, and again, not in a necessarily permanent way, but a more flexible way that can be moved on a daily basis for some of our grazing designs. And then you have to decide how you're going to divide that pasture into smaller paddocks. And here's just one design. We've got a square pasture, and so we've put out 4 different paddocks with that water right in the center. And that's a very simple, straightforward design. It works adequately if that's what you have, and you would move the animals according to how well the grass is growing, at a minimum, probably once a week, so that by starting in pasture 1 and moving the animals throughout the other pastures, you're giving that pasture 1 at least 30 days to recover from being grazed before you put the animals back in. Oops. Here's another design where we're going to even smaller paddocks. And so depending again on the animals and how they like to graze, this is a possibility. It's not something we normally recommend much because anytime you get into triangular corners like this, animals tend to feel rather trapped, and they don't necessarily want to be in those corners. In addition, we also look at things like the distance from watering systems, because where are they going to congregate but around the water? So there's a lot of different things we have to think about when putting together grazing designs. And of course, very few of us have, gorgeous 5 acres of square pastures. We all have topography and hills and streams and wells and other things to take in consideration. So the grazing design is something that needs to be flexible and needs to be designed with the notion of potentially changing it as we become more proficient at managing our grazing systems. The other thing to keep in mind is to understand your animals and the type of animal you have and how do they graze, because different animals graze in different ways. Sheep tend to be really close to the ground grazers. Goats like to browse and would rather jump over a fence or climb on it. Horses are highly selective in what they will or won't graze, and other things can also make a factor. Something like horses, they tend to drop their manure all in one location, and those become hot spots for parasites, and something we need to think about. So understanding the grazing habits can also make a difference, help us create a different design for our grazing system. As far as when to take the animals out and move them from pasture to pasture, or when to put them in, is really, again, focusing on that forage and trying to maintain quality forage so that we can quickly come back and reutilize that paddock again. So a general rule of thumb is that we graze half and leave half. So the ideal situation would be to put the animals onto a pasture when that cool season grass has grown to be about 8 inches tall. That's where we're maximizing that yield to quality intersect. Well, when we move to a new paddock, we're going to let them graze, and then we would watch, and when the forages are down to on average about 4 inches, we would move the animals to a new paddock. And once we've moved them, we're going to take another pasture walk. And this time we're going to go out and look at why did they not eat something? Why are some of these plants still 10, 12 inches tall now versus other things that are nibbled to the ground? So in other words, what do my animals really like? Or what do they not like? Or perhaps where those weeds are really tall is where the thistles are beginning to come in and we didn't notice. Or maybe that's where the snake lives in that pasture and the horses don't want to go over there. So we need to understand why they are or are not eating various portions of the pasture. And then lastly, we would encourage you to go in and mow that paddock and so that you have a consistent height of that 4 inches. So we remove the older material that they didn't eat, because by the time they go in the next time, it will be even stimmier and harder for them to eat, and they'll avoid it and only eat the new growth anyway. And that way we're also then minimizing that weed competition eventually. The last point I have up on this slide is probably the most important, and that grazing is definitely, there's some science behind it, but it really becomes an art. And some of our best grazers will tell you that it is their record keeping that helps them predict what paddock the animals should go into the next time, because it's not a matter of moving them from paddock 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Depending on the season, you might go from 1 to 3 to 6, and the next season, 2 to 5 to 3, or whatever. Because each paddock will have different types of forages in it. The weather will make a large difference on how fast the various forages are growing. And so record keeping from year to year helps you become a better grazer to know how to maximize the production on your pastures. As I said, one of the keys and the reasons to rotate is to give the forages a chance to rest and regrow, and more importantly, to reestablish and regrow some of that root system and put root reserve, or sugars and so forth, back down in the root reserve so that they can regrow quickly again after you have allowed the animals to graze it. And so that minimum 3 weeks, preferably 4 weeks before you put the animals back in, is really critical to try and maintain quality forage in your pastures. Is it always 3 to 4 weeks? No. It really is dependent on weather. And so, again, that art of grazing comes in. Because perhaps, there's been some Julys or Augusts where we had droughty conditions where really good grazers took their animals off the pastures, and just put them into one, and it became a dry lot, and they fed them hay, so that the rest of their pastures were not damaged. And so we have to really look at the forages itself to determine the best way to manage the entire system. This is just a real quick diagram of some of the things I've been talking about. That on the bottom left over here is our grazing period. So and then if we have the recovery allowed. So if we have a short grazing period, say 3 to 5 days, and then give it a month to recover, we are not only maintaining a lot of forage on the top, but we have a large root system that plant can recover from. If the grazing period over here is continuous, the animals are constantly able to come back and eat off this plant, and it has to constantly recover, eventually it's going to deplete that root system, and overall, in the long run, we may lose that plant and we'll end up with bare spots. And as a result, end up with poor pasture quality. So our goal in rotationally grazing is trying to maintain not this upper part of the plant, but to really focus on the lower part of this plant and maintaining a really extensive, active root system to support the growth that we need to have animals on the pastures. If the forage is taller than 12 inches, which, boy, in this spring it's a good possibility with these hot weather, these grasses are really growing fast. Some suggestions would be that obviously you'd like to graze it down if at all possible. If you don't have enough animals to do that, this would be the time to consider making hay in that field. For that's one reason to keep those temporary fences on the inside so you can take them down and go out and take some hay in the spring. Then you also, we really don't encourage you to allow the pasture to go more than 12 inches so that if it gets too tall, it can just lay over and then you end up with mold problems in that pasture. As well as much more than 12 inches means that there's probably some weeds that are going to seed. And so we do want to go in and mow that and prevent that from getting too tall in the spring. A couple last points. In the fall, our forages do need a rest period before they go into winter. And so normally the rule of thumb is that we're going to remove the animals from pasture 30 days before a frost. So up here in northern Illinois, that tends to be about September 15th, and further south, it would be a little later, but about 30 days. And that's to give those plants enough chance to reestablish that root system and be able to come out of winter with strong, healthy growth in the spring. Now, once we do have a hard frost and the cool seasons, grasses are dormant, you can turn the animals back out to graze for a time. It is important, though, to try and leave that 4 inches of stubble in that pasture to protect the growing points of the legumes and grasses so that they can make it through a very rough winter. I promised you some resources, and these are the resources that I would recommend. Our Illinois Agronomy Handbook was just posted on the website, and that's the URL for it. There's a chapter there on soil fertility that will help you understand the soil testing a little bit better. And there's this whole chapter on hay and pasture management. And when I was talking about establishments and seeding rates and the type of forages you might think about, especially for the different types of animals, I would recommend you go to that chapter. There's several tables there talking about different seeding rates and seeding mixtures of grasses and legumes for the different types of pastures you might use. We do have a CD available through our publications office. It's Pasture for Horses, but I would say probably about 90% of it would apply to any animal, and it's an excellent guide on pasture management and grazing management for animals. The last one listed there is the Turf and Weed ID booklet that I was talking about for grass identification. Really easy guide to use to know what pasture plants are in your pasture. And the last two there are available by our publication offices, and that's the 800 number, or you can go on our website and click on the Publications tab to get there. One other resource I wanted to point you to is our e-extension website. This is our national extension website. So all of the different state extension services have gone together to post most of the materials, or a lot of the materials, up on the website. And so you'll see on the right-hand side are the topics that are currently available. This is a growing website. Every day new things get posted. But you'll see that there's quite a bit of information available on beef cattle, on goats, dairy, and horses. And they have quite a bit of information about pastures and grazing, and it will point you out to really excellent resources available to you as well. Last thing is that if you are interested in grazing, a beginner level of grazing information is available on a cooperative publication with the University of Illinois Extension and the Natural Resource Conservation Service for Illinois. This is the website for our Illinois Grazing Manual. These are individual fact sheets on many, many different aspects of things to think about when putting together a grazing plan. They're all downloadable. You can go there and pick and choose what you'd like to have in your grazing manual. So with that, we covered a lot in a short time. I hope I've given you some basic things to think about for maintenance of your pastures, as well as that decision-making between reestablishing a pasture versus trying to renovate what you already have. And then lastly, that grazing is really an excellent way to maintain good quality pasture. And I guess my advice on that would be to really keep those grazing plans simple as a beginner starting out. And what's most important is to not allow those animals to overgraze, but to really focus on the quality of forage so that forage can recover quickly and give you a lot of tonnage so that your animals can eat very heartily on that pasture. With that, I'd just like to wish you well in your pasture management, and I can stay on and answer as many questions as you have. Otherwise, thank you very much. My email is on that first slide. Feel free to email me if you have any questions at all.
Okay, I was wondering about maintaining your pasture with after the horses have compacted it over several years. Is there anything that you recommend to loosen the soil so that it is not as compacted?
If they're compacting the soil, probably means that there's too many animals in that area. So one to be look at the number of animals per pasture area that you have. If it's severely compacted, that might be the paddock that you choose to renovate this year or to completely reestablish this year. I know some of our better grazers will do that. They will choose the worst pasture that's not producing much, use that as the dry lot over winter, and then the next spring go in and completely reestablish it. And at that point, you can use tillage to break up that compaction and get it growing better again.
Okay, would you recommend the use of, I call it a plugger. It's a thing about as big around as your thumb. It's on a rotating wheel, and it pulls up a plug out of the ground. Would that loosen the soil, or would that not be recommended?
The core aeration is a recommendation that we do use in, for instance, like lawn grasses to try and alleviate the impact of compaction. But that's for not really severe compaction, and so it's not going to help a tremendous amount. It can't hurt, but
Okay.
I would not expect dramatic results for that because animals tend to compact much more than what we have on lawns. So.
Okay, thank you.
What do you recommend for this time of year?
Well, obviously, our pastures are up and growing much earlier than normal, so this is definitely a unique year because normally wouldn't be talking about it for another month probably.
Right.
I mean, the concern also always is transitioning animals from your feedlot, hay kind of diet over to greener pastures, particularly for horses. That's really critical.
Mm-hmm.
Vets will recommend that you fill them up on hay and then slowly turn them out, just starting with half an hour and then adding time every day to slowly transition their guts. But as far as the pastures go, yes, I mean the pastures up here in northern Illinois are 8 inches, and so you could potentially go out and graze. If it turns cold again, those plants are going to slow down in their growth, and so you have to be really careful and watch them. We've not had much rain up here, so from that standpoint, I'm not as concerned about hoof damage, but certainly in a typical wet spring, another reason to keep them off the pastures would be if it's too wet, and their hooves would do too much damage to that forage because those the hooves can really, especially horses, they tend to really dig in and do quite a bit of damage to the pastures. So keeping them off when it's wet is also important.
Okay, thank you.
Otherwise, thank you very much. As I said, you do have my email. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, and good luck in your pastures this year.
Thank you, Alan.
My pleasure.